What's always bothered me about how-to videos on making wine is people make the wine, but then you really don't know how it tastes because they show you how to make it and then it's months or years later before they actually try it. So I'm doing this a little bit differently. I made oak leaf wine and we're going to see how it tastes first. We'll start with that. Mm, this is very good. So why oak leaf wine? Well, honestly, it's a little weird. I've been making quite a bit of wine over the years, and I tend to do things that are unusual. I don't have a great source of grapes, which it makes the easiest wine, so I make a lot of country wines. And I ran across the recipe for oak leaf wine on the internet one day, and I'm like, oh wow, this sounds really interesting. And so, reading up on it, there was a lot of anecdotal evidence out there uh, that people made it, but not a lot of people describing how it turned out. And so I think what's happened is maybe on the internet a lot of this has just been copied forward from other people. So I decided I'll make it myself. The recipe that I started with was actually one that I found on Jack Keller's site. Um, I don't think that site's available anymore, but the recipe was out there, and there was actually two recipes. There was one for young oak leaf wine, and then there was another for old oak leaf wine. The only difference between the two recipes was either you were using young leaves or using old leaves. So I decided to do this in the spring when there were young leaves available. Again, anecdotally, they say that the two taste very differently, but I haven't tried the latter. So here's the original recipe that I started with for 1 gallon of wine. It only calls for 6 simple ingredients: oak leaves, sugar, oranges, lemons, water, and yeast. That's about as simple as a recipe comes. But sometimes, like cooking, the simple ones are the more difficult to do. In my recipe, I added a few extra ingredients. I added some acid blend, potassium metabisulfite, potassium sorbate, as well as some yeast nutrient. While they aren't exactly necessary, I think they provide some additional control over the end product. So let's start with the main ingredient, oak leaves. I think that's really what got me interested. When I read making wine from leaves, it just sounded so bizarre. And have you ever tried eating an oak leaf or even eating an acorn? They're extremely bitter. And that was something that I was like, well, how do you make a good wine from that? Well, it ends up that the thing that makes the oak leaves bitter is also the thing that makes the wine. It's full of tannins. You will find tannins in all red wine and most other wines. In fact, if you're making country wines, they generally have you add it because it's really an essential flavor. Not only is it a flavor, but it's also a preservative, so it helps to preserve the wine. So the tannins do a couple things. One is they preserve, and they also provide a bite when you take a drink of the wine. And so having oak leaves with tannins in it really makes some sense. When you go out to gather your leaves, you need to make sure that you actually get oak leaves. I'm not sure that it matters which type of oak leaves, but it does need to be oak leaves to have oak leaf wine, obviously. While I don't think the type matters, what does matter is that you get fresh leaves. When I was out looking for leaves, even in the early spring, I found that there's a lot of bugs and things that like oak leaves as well. So you need to avoid the ones that have insects on them. I went ahead and collected ones that were free of insects, and then I gave them a good wash later. So how many leaves do you collect? Well, it depends on how much wine you're going to make. In my case, I was going to make 5 gallons of wine. So the recipe calls for 7 pints of oak leaves per gallon of wine. So I gathered a little under 5 gallons of oak leaves. The other question is are these oak leaves pressed down or not? And in my case, I went ahead and lightly pressed them into the bucket, but I didn't smash them in to fill every millimeter of space. So now you've got your leaves. The next step with this is to wash those leaves. Now, there's stuff on organic material that you collect out there, and not all of it makes great wine. So everything that you have on those leaves that's not what you're looking for needs to go. So I did the washing of the leaves very carefully. I took my job seriously. I washed each one just to make sure. So do a good job with that and you'll be happy with yourself later. After we gather our leaves and we've got them all washed, what we need to do now is we need to extract the essence of those leaves. There's different ways to do that, but in this case, we're going to be doing it by pouring boiling water over the leaves and letting them steep, just like you would make tea. And essentially that's what we're making here, is a tea from the leaves. I put on a couple of pots of water to boil. Do you have to have 5 gallons of water to steep the leaves? No, you definitely don't. What you need though is you just need enough hot water that you can cover the leaves and let them steep. So in this case I had a couple of pots of water, probably a couple, 3 gallons was what I ended up with. And I poured this over the leaves and let them and covered them. The recipe calls for you to steep these things for 24 hours. I got hung up on, I had to go on a vacation, so I was gone for 7 days. And so I figured it would be safe to let them steep for 7 days because there wasn't any chance that it was going to start fermenting on its own. There was no sugar or anything in there, so I let them go for 7 days and I was okay, no harm. Now that our leaves are steeped, it's time to go on to our next step, which is to add 2 other ingredients that we have. We're adding citrus to this. We're adding some lemons and we're adding some oranges. We're going to add both the zest as well as the juice. So why are we adding citrus to this? I think it's because we need some flavor in this besides the oak leaves. In a lot of country wines, you'll find that you add either oranges or lemons to something that is floral, that doesn't have a lot of other flavor. What comes to mind is elderflower wine, where it has a lot of fragrance to it, but there isn't a lot else to it. So when you add some citrus to it, that gives it a good flavor. The other thing that you're going to get from oranges and lemons is you're going to get acid, and acid is very important in wine. You really need a good acid balance in order to have a good wine. So theoretically, at least, by adding the oranges and the lemons, you'll get the acid where you want it to be. Once you have everything in there, give it a good stir and mix it up. So now, what do we have? We've got a few gallons of leaf water with some oranges and lemons in it. Our next ingredient on the list is sugar, and we need to add that. Now, if you've tried to add sugar to a cold liquid, you know that doesn't work very well. So we're going to go ahead and add it with some heat to it. Let's talk about the sugar for a minute. When you're adding sugar to this, because it has no natural sugars of its own, you're going to add enough sugar to reach an ending alcohol level that you want. So in this case, as we look at the instructions once again, it calls for 3 pounds of sugar per gallon of liquid. Very little other sugar, so it's probably just the 3 pounds that we're going to consider right now. I know that 3.2 ounces of sugar that's dissolved in 1 gallon of water, if it is completely fermented out, will yield 1% alcohol plus some carbon dioxide at the end. So 3.2 ounces of sugar will yield 1% alcohol. If we have 3 pounds of sugar, which is 48 ounces, divided by 3.2, that will yield 15% alcohol once it's fermented completely out. That's very high. That makes for some very high alcohol wine if it's all fermented out. Since this is an old recipe, I'm guessing that they are not intending to get 15% alcohol out of this. But I'm going to go ahead and go with what they've got, and I'm adding 3 pounds of sugar per gallon. At 3 pounds of sugar per gallon, at the end of this, I should end up with 5 gallons of 15% alcohol, if it works out that way. Well, if you've ever tried to dissolve 15 pounds of sugar in a few gallons of liquid, you know that's not an easy thing to do. It won't work. It's like trying to dissolve your sugar in your iced tea when it's cold. It just doesn't work. Well, fortunately, we're going to heat this to do a couple things. We're going to bring this up to a simmer, which will help us dissolve all of our sugar in our liquid, but it's also going to help extract some additional flavors from our orange zest and lemon zest. That's a good thing. And finally, it's going to sterilize the liquid. We're going to bring it up to a simmer and simmer it for about 20 minutes, which will kill anything that's in there that we don't want living in our wine. We're going to add our sugar, we're going to give it a simmer, and then we're going to strain it through cheesecloth. In my case, it took a few rounds of this because I had too much liquid that would fit in all my pots. So you need to plan accordingly. At this point, this stuff is smelling really good. I've got all of my liquid, I've got it in a bucket. I'm going to add enough cool water to bring it up to 5 gallons at this point, because we have all of our sugar in there, we have everything that's going to take up space, so let's do that. I added my water, and when I checked the temperature, it turned out to be just about 90 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about where we want it for what we're going to do next. The first thing I'm going to do, though, is I'm going to check my sugar content to see if it's what I think it is. Remember, I had added sugar to it, but there was also some sugar from the lemons and the oranges that I need to account for. So in this case, I use my hydrometer. My hydrometer is calibrated to work at 60 degrees Fahrenheit. The liquid that I have here is 90 degrees, so be sure and make necessary adjustments. My potential alcohol for this batch is going to be 16.5. That's a little higher than the 15% that I thought it was going to be. Why the difference? I think I was a little sloppy in my measurements, for one. It's always better to do this and check yourself with a hydrometer rather than just going straight from a recipe. There's just too many variables out there. So now I know what my potential alcohol is. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to spend a minute to check the pH. Now, we talked about acid earlier, but I don't know exactly what the acid level is of my must. In order to do that, I could taste it, but given how much sugar's in it, it's probably not going to give me a good idea of what's going to end up like once all that sugar has been fermented out. So I use a pH meter to check. This is the safest way to do it. I've made a lot of wine, and something that I've found is that if you check your pH and get your acid right at the beginning, your wines are just going to turn out so much better. They won't be too sour, and they won't be bland and insipid either. So pH measures acidity on a scale, that scale is between 0 and 14, with 7 being distilled water. We want things to be acidic, so that's on the low end of the scale. So we want it to be somewhere between 3.0 and 3.4 for a white wine. That varies on which type of wine you're making. I also think it varies on how much you're going to sweeten it at the end. If you're going to have a dry wine, you may not want the acid to be that high or the pH that low. But in my case, I decided I wanted to end up with a pH of about 3.4 at the end. I put the pH meter in it and I checked it, and it looks like my pH is 4.96 or almost 5. What happened? Well, maybe there wasn't as much acid in the fruit as we thought, or maybe there was a flaw in the recipe. But no matter how you look at it, that's not nearly acidic enough for wine. So I ended up adding acid blend in order to make up the difference. And I was about 7 teaspoons was what it took to get the acid to where I wanted it to be at 3.40. Keep this in mind when you make your own wine, to be sure and check the acid. When you're adding your acid blend to your wine, be sure and do it in increments, because you never know exactly when it's going to take a jump in pH. There are online calculators that you can use to estimate how much you need, but it's best to still do it in increments, because it's easy to add acid to a wine. It's very difficult to get it out when you're done. So we're almost done with the hard part. We have a sugary liquid that has some flavor to it, and we have it at the right temperature. We have it at the right specific gravity. We have it at the right pH. So we're just about ready to go. The one thing we need to do now, though, is decide on our yeast. I gave this must a taste at this point, and boy was I surprised. It was really, really good. It tasted exactly like lemon iced tea to me. Very sweet, very lemony, and very much like iced tea. It had that tea flavor to it. Really, that's not as much of a surprise as it should have been, because essentially what we're getting from those leaves is we're getting the tannins, that structure that tea has, and that's exactly what you would find in iced tea. So I shouldn't have been so surprised. But boy was it delicious. I almost sat down and drank a glass of it. But I figured it would be better as wine. You remember when I said that the sugar was okay as it was, even though it was a little high? So let's look at the way they used to make wine versus the way we make wine today. Back in the old days, they used yeast that was they used the yeast that they had. That yeast was either yeast that was in the air, or they may have used bread yeast to add to it. Either way, those yeasts did not produce as much alcohol as modern yeasts do. Modern yeasts are designed to go up to a particular amount of alcohol and then die off, so you have a little more control with them. With bread yeast, which is probably as good as they would have gotten back then, you're going to get somewhere between 9 and 11% alcohol from that, no matter how much sugar you have in it. The yeast will die off from alcohol poisoning once it reaches that point. So, even though the recipe called for 15% potential alcohol, it was probably going to hit about 10%, and the rest of that 5% was going to be sweetener at the end. Wow, that would be very sweet wine to have that much sugar in it. But country wines were sweet back then. So I want to go ahead and stay true to the recipe and have a sweet wine, but probably not that low in alcohol of the wine. Which brings me to my next point, is choosing a yeast. There are lots of yeasts out there, all with their own little flavors to them. I tend to pick ones that give me what I'm looking for, based on potential alcohol and whether it's something that I want floral, something that I'm looking for, um, whether it's a red or a white. There are some safe yeasts out there and some that aren't so safe. But I went ahead and just took what I had in my refrigerator at the time, which was QA23 yeast. If everything's perfect, QA23 yeast will hit 16% alcohol. So if you remember, my potential alcohol was 16.5 and my yeast might hit 16. So I'm going to have a very strong wine either way, and depending on how high it actually goes will depend on how sweet it's going to be. This is fun. I'm really betting it's not going to get to 16%, so I went ahead and pitched the yeast. So we're almost done adding ingredients. One other thing besides the yeast is yeast nutrient. Yeast needs to be happy. If your yeast isn't happy, you're going to get off flavors in your wine either early on or later on, and you just really don't want to risk that. So to prevent that, I added a bit of yeast nutrient since I didn't see a lot of other nutrients coming out of those leaves. I added the yeast nutrient at a rate of about 1 teaspoon per gallon. So now what? Well, we just need to let the yeast do its thing. We need to keep it happy. It needs to be in the right temperature and it needs to get some oxygen mixed in with it. One of the fallacies with wine is that oxygen is always bad when it comes to wine, and that's not true. In the early fermentation periods, yeast is an aerobic activity and it definitely needs to have oxygen in order to do its thing. So we need to stir it a couple of times a day and make sure you froth in a little bit of air when you do it. So we pitched our yeast, and here's what it looks like 12 hours after pitching our yeast. It's really looking like it should. There's a layer on top that is yeast. You can tell that it's beginning to reproduce. It smells like fresh baking bread, and that's exactly what we're looking for. Don't forget to give it a stir a couple of times a day. Here it is at 36 hours. You can tell that it's really starting to boil, that the fermentation is really taking hold. And once again, this is exactly what we're looking for. Continue to stir. Around day 4 or 5, I check the specific gravity again to see where we're at. Whenever the specific gravity hits about 1.02, we need to put it in the secondary and put it under an airlock. In this case, day 5 was when we hit that. We racked all of the wine into the secondary and put it under an airlock. Then the waiting begins. All fermentations are different, but this one was really lengthy. It went on for a long time, and I'm not exactly sure why. It could have been the yeast. Maybe it's a little slower fermenter. Maybe it was the temperature. Who knows? But it was a healthy fermentation. It was just slow. I checked the specific gravity on day 35, and it was at 1.1, but it was still fermenting, albeit slowly. You know, patience when you're making wine early on is something that's very difficult. I find that patience is helped when you have a good inventory of wine to drink and you're not looking into the stuff that you're making right then. I was able to just let it sit back there and do its thing. I racked it about 30 days into it, and then maybe 45 days after that. And at day 128, I decided it was time to bottle it. Here's a couple more ingredients that were not on the original list that were added. I added 1 1/8 teaspoon per gallon of potassium metabisulfite, and I also added 1/2 teaspoon per gallon of potassium sorbate. Now, these two are very important in modern day winemaking that they did not use back then. In this case, I had a very sweet liquid and a very long fermentation, and I was a little worried that if I bottled this, it may start re-fermenting. And frankly, there's just no reason to take that risk anymore. I didn't want to have bottles exploding, and I didn't want to have sparkling wine. So I went ahead and added those things. Those prevent the yeast from reproducing. It also helps to protect the wine from oxygen. So at day 130, we went ahead and bottled. And so here we are. And I've got a glass of wine, and it's good. So what are some of the lessons that I've learned? This is a very sweet wine with very high alcohol. Normally, both those things are something that I do not like. I don't like something that tastes like rocket fuel, and I certainly don't like something that's very sweet. I'm more of a dry wine person. However, in this case, it sort of works. The sweetness helps to mask the high alcohol, and the high alcohol makes it, frankly, a little more enjoyable. And so it's actually something that I've grown to like. It's also something that's very nice to be able to share with your friends and talk about how you made it. Because let's face it, this is weird stuff. Most people would never think of having a wine that was made from oak leaves. So it's a lot of fun. It also appeals to my sense of history to make a wine that's something that was made a long time ago, back before they had access to grocery stores and grapes and sugar and things like that. So what would I do differently? I think one thing I would do differently is I would probably add some pectic enzyme at the beginning. It's hard to see, but this wine is not entirely clear. Even though it sat for a long time, it never did quite get rid of that pectin haze. If I had added some pectic enzyme before the fermentation, I think that would have prevented this and cleared it out. And in fact, I'm going to try it again next time. Well, this has been fun. This has been a great project. I hope you try it. I'm definitely going to do it again. If you have any comments to leave, please leave them below. I would love to hear how your oak leaf wine comes out. And peace and God bless.